This is the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. 2025 was a big year for film. Theaters drew people in for a wide variety of stories. Moviegoers saw thrillers like Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another and Josh Safdie's Marty Supreme. They saw the returns of beloved characters with James Gunn's Superman and James Cameron's Avatar: Fire and Ash. They embraced the strange with Bugonia, the romantic with Materialists, and the tragic with Frankenstein. But as has been increasingly the case in recent years, droves of moviegoers also showed up to films with heavily religious themes. Faith-based studios and directors produced a variety of faith-forward movies, with family-friendly animated movies like David or Light of the World, and more mature films such as Guns N' Moses or The Last Rodeo. But faith also appeared in many religiously unaffiliated Hollywood films, such as the latest installment of the Knives Out franchise, which focused on the murder of a controversial Catholic priest, and Ryan Coogler's Sinners, which explored the clashes of spirituality and conventional religion. As the Oscars are fast approaching this weekend, we had Religion Unplugged's culture editor Jillian Cheney and film critic Joseph Holmes sit down with public intellectual and theologian Paul Anleitner. Paul is the president and CEO of Goodmakers and the author of Based on a True Story, Vibe Shifts, The End of Deconstruction, and the Reboot of Meaning, which comes out this summer and is available for pre-order now. Jillian, Joseph, and Paul talk through the spiritual and religious themes of some of this year's most beloved Oscar nominees, including Sinners, Train Dreams, One Battle After Another, and F1. Can these films show us what Hollywood actually thinks about religion? Here's Joseph, Jillian, and Paul.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I am Joseph Holmes, culture critic for Religion Unplugged, and thank you for coming to the Religion Unplugged podcast. And of course, as always, welcome back, Jillian Cheney, and we have with us our guest today, Paul Anleitner, to talk about our annual conversation around the Oscars and faith at the Oscars. So, to start us off, obviously, Jillian, what are you? Introduce yourself. I totally nailed that.
Yeah, you're doing great. I think we're so comfortable with each other doing any kind of officiality. It feels like I don't know, we're letting outsiders in a sacred space. Yeah, I'm Jillian Cheney. I am a culture editor at Religion Unplugged. And I regularly write about movies, but all kinds of other culture as well, music, books, theater, so on and so forth. I'm excited for today. I'm excited about the Oscars. Although this year, and maybe this is just me, but the Oscars have been different this year. I don't know. The movies have been I don't know. This is, I guess, kind of a garbled thesis statement, but Sinners has completely taken over everything. I mean, it's the most Oscar-nominated movie of all time. And so that to me feels like the standout. There are a couple other like notable ones as well, but I don't know. I'm kind of this year I feel more of a bystander and someone who is like interested to see what wins and interested to see like what people think. But I'm excited to talk today.
Absolutely. And of course, so Paul, we've talked a bit online, we've gone back and forth, but it's really cool to see you in person. So tell everybody who you are. Who the heck are you?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. Yeah, I'm best term I can probably put together, which doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people, but some people get it, is a cultural theologian. So I'm interested in the way in which culture and story shapes our views on God, the world, our place in it all. And so I do a lot of my writing and speaking is about not so much I'm not a film critic, right? I'm not assessing. I have an eye for cinematography and things like that. I'm not really focusing on that level. What I'm interested in is the way in which these stories function in some ways as in a secular, post-secular age, they can function as alternative sacred texts to people in culture. The ways in which these stories resonate and shape our ideas on God ourself, our place in the whole story. They shape them, but they also like disclose, especially based on cultural response. We can see in the response of audiences if they gravitate to a particular story, if a story does get potentially awards like an Oscar, that it may be a sign in which the message is in that story, the ideas embedded in it might be resonating with our particular cultural moment. So I'm really fascinated by that. I write. I've got a book coming out in this summer called Based on a True Story that does a lot of work on influential cultural stories and the ways they've shaped us. That's probably. I also. I lead a nonprofit called Goodmakers, which is dedicated to the project of cultural renewal and getting leaders together across the United States that care about culture, care about the restoration of truth, goodness, and beauty. And I'm also a religion and culture fellow at the Archbridge Institute. So I do some writing and more academic work over there.
Nice. Well, I think everybody can just get by that why you and I might get along.
Yeah,
So,
for sure. Yeah.
yes. Well, I want to just jump into something that you mentioned, which is talking about the storytelling aspect, because that's why basically we do this every year, is because I kind of look at this in a way that, religious institutions and belief systems and Hollywood are two kind of rival or complementary storytelling groups in America. They both, uh, attempt to say that we have a story that explains the reality of the world you live in either macro or micro sense. And so when you look at how, whether it's a pastor talking about Hollywood or you took at Hollywood talking about faith, you really are getting to see kind of how different storyteller groups are talking about either their rivals or their partner storytellers, how they see it. And I think particularly for the Oscars, what I find interesting about it is that you have the storytellers saying what stories that they told that they think are the most important. So it really does tell you something about this group of storytellers and what they're talking about with faith and what they believe about it. And so that's, I think, something that can be very insightful and helpful, particularly for those of us who are very interested in religion and therefore some of this dialogue that goes on, whether it's particularly heated or it's friendly. It's a really good and helpful for me to have these conversations. So I think, Jillian's kind of given a preview kind of her thoughts on the Oscars already. So Paul, let's just start with you. When you're looking at the Oscar rollout of nominees this year, what do you think for you is kind of the headline? And actually, I'm going to go right in here and list off the Best Picture nominees for those who don't know them yet. Okay. So you got The Secret Agent, you've got Bugonia, you've got Marty Supreme, you've got Train Dreams, you got F1 the movie, you've got Sinners, the most nominated film in Oscars history. You got Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, Hamnet, One Battle After Another, and Sentimental Value. And of course, many people haven't seen all the Oscar movies. If you haven't seen them, you can look them up. We want to just dive right in. So Paul, what are your thoughts on how faith is dealt with in those and of course other nominee movies this year?
Yeah, I'm rarely ever concerned too much about what wins the award itself. I mean, like whether it's that or the Grammys, I think the naming of something as being best for a work of art is, I don't know, it's a somewhat a silly endeavor, but I do think it's significant in that this is what, in many ways, like the cultural tastemakers, the ones that do have influence in giving us particular stories, the stories that form and shape us, what they are saying and pointing to, as you mentioned before, and going, we see these as being stories of significance. Obviously, there's a component in which it might not just be the story itself, but it could also be the aesthetic experience, right? So I think of a film like Train Dreams, which I think is nominated not only because you could have told that story a myriad of ways, but it's the aesthetic experience of beauty that resonates. And so while I'm very much focused on like narrative symbolism, I also want to recognize that in a lot of ways, the criteria for among cultural tastemakers for naming something as being a significant work of art isn't just because of the explicit narrative as if you were reading a book. It's the aesthetic experience. It is the sound. It's light. It's the motion picture itself. It's the experience of sound and image. So I think that's important to note as well. While I have a bias towards the narrative side, I recognize and be helpful for people to recognize that it's not just analyzing the themes, but the you might say the more noetic kind of knowing, the noetic experience of being in the theater. And so it's an interesting list. I'm sure we'll maybe start unpacking some of these in a little bit.
Yeah, so why don't, I guess, Jillian, why don't you start listing and the ways, kind of the headlines for you in terms of how you saw faith portrayed, what kind of conversation is being had and with faith. You talked about sinners particularly, so you can talk about that, but then others, if you see any patterns involved.
Yeah. So one, I really like Paul bringing up the fact that he doesn't think, because I guess my thesis statement is kind of on the same thing. I it's always interesting to me to see who wins, to see, you know, what a certain group of people think are the tastemakers. And you kind of get, in ballot predictions. I don't really do fantasy football, but like Oscars predictions, I do like to do. And so you get, okay, well, who won, the SAG-AFTRA awards, who won the Emmy, who, all that kind of stuff. Um, and so it's always interesting to kind of see, yeah, like what people have decided are the tastemakers. And I think the Oscars are still an institution that defines that for a certain class of cinema, often which does include like the aesthetic preferences of movies. But yeah, it's always really interesting, and I would definitely one be willing to or would want to dive in later to a conversation about, is this it? Like, is the Oscars offering like is that the end all be all of tastemakers? And I think our answers would all say no, but kind of exploring that question. But yeah, I mean, looking at Sinners, which is one the most, again, most nominated Oscar movie of all time, and also probably, I guess, my favorite of the ways that it explores faith, just because it's just incredibly nuanced and incredibly well researched, and there's a lot of depth to it that I really like. And Joseph and I have had conversations about Sinners before on previous podcasts, but yeah, I just think it's really interesting, and the way that it explores like the way that music interacts with spirituality and the way that spirituality interacts with community and with ethnicity and all those sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great movie. It's kind of like I think there's so much to dive into there, which I want to talk about the other movies as well. But there's just so much complexity there that I think it's definitely worth exploring.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talked about on the podcast, obviously, is that Sinners really does do one of the big kind of highlights for me of the year when I'm looking at patterns of the Oscars, is this move from, a dichotomy of here's the secular world versus here's the religious world, and these are kind of at war with each other, and you're kind of picking between those, to a move from what's bad or problematic is organized religion. And or at least traditional organized religion and Christian organized religion, male dominated organized religion. Some of these are kind of, are kind of conflated a little bit to individual spirituality being positive. Is what's fascinating about Sinners is that essentially you have Sammy, who's kind of the protagonist. He's this, musical protege, and he's kind of caught between these different mentor figures. He has his dad, who is, a Southern Baptist preacher, and he's saying, "Hey, you got to use your music, for Jesus, or you're going to end up, losing your soul to the devil." And then you've got his uncles, his men in his life, both played by Michael B. Jordan, who are like, "Hey, all this spirituality stuff is nonsense, and you just have to, work hard and, scheme a little bit, steal, hustle, and that's how you get by." And then, of course, you have Annie, who is the spiritual hoodoo practicing, kind of a spiritual person who has more indigenous black faith, but still, it's a very individual thing that's kind of vague exactly where any kind of structure is, if there is any. And she's actually the one who's wise spiritually. She recognizes that vampires and things don't exist. You can follow her advice and knowledge that she's got passed down. Unlike, any sort of the Christian symbolism or Christian prayers, which don't actually have power over the vampires within the story. And, there's a lot that's done in there about kind of the particular Black experience. You can look at the conversations about race, where it's like Christianity doesn't have power because it actually promotes assimilation rather than, a defiance and kind of, personal power of your heritage. You can do all sorts of that kind of stuff. Which a lot of people were very willing to point out to me when I gave a lukewarm review of Sinners earlier last year. But what's interesting is the pattern for me that is in all these other Oscar movies. And this is not, of course, uniform, but you see this, of course, in terms of something like Sentimental Value, where it has the church is kind of, you're skeptical towards that, but, in personal prayer, which is kind of a personal cry out, that can kind of create a bond between people when they express that. You have Hamnet, which again, the Agnes, was the Shakespeare's wife, who is like a kind of a witch character. She's got her personal, very, again, sort of witch-like spirituality, but she rejects the church as not having good, wise sort of advice. And so the movie kind of follows her track in terms of what it expresses in terms of symbolism. Again, you see this with a lot of the other movies as well, where there's a lot of, skepticism and even hostility towards what organized religion can provide, but that there is a lot of positive ideas about what personal kind of beliefs and faith can provide. Now, there's a couple of sort of exceptions to this. You have Frankenstein, which uses a lot of Christian spirituality and specifically Christian symbolism in a positive way with, I think it's Elizabeth who, has a cross and things like that. And you have the creature who is taught, the Bible and to read those things. But again, that's still sort of put into kind of a personal spirituality box. And then you have One Battle After Another, which is, a lot of the bad guys have a sort of weird, corrupted fantasy version of faith that's sort of institutional, whereas the good characters who, are activists have crosses, do prayers, they have more traditional Christian symbolism, although the group of nuns that they use are based on a group of heretical nuns. So it's still kind of like, that's more the old school, like last year was basically, you're good if you have left-wing politics, you're bad if you have right-wing politics. That's kind of our baseline. And so that One Battle After Another kind of goes that track rather than the organized religion, bad, personal spirituality, good. Oh, Train Dreams. Again, it's not that organized religion is not portrayed necessarily as bad, but just kind of like not like further away from the truth.
Irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. Further away from the truth than like a personal spirituality. So anyway, that's kind of what I see when I'm looking at these. What Paul, again, like this is, I call myself a culture critic. You were just like another step up. You're like cultural theologian. So
I think you're being bashful here.
What would you look at as sort of your headline for this, and what would you kind of maybe counter to what I said or add on to that?
Well, a through line would be I think us coming out of the backside of the secular age. And I think a through line here throughout many of these is the concept of re-enchantment. So the idea under maybe a dogmatic materialist vision of the world that I think for many people, especially in among the cultural tastemakers of the last 20 years, has been the de facto norm. The new atheist heyday, a very flat vision of the world. I mean, there's obviously the things we can talk about with, the influence of Marx within Hollywood and the propensity to reduce art, eliminate the vertical dimension of it and reduce art to being about nothing more than the horizontal component of political relationships, class struggle, etc. What I think you see even with Sinners and other films, and we've seen this for the last few years, is there's an increasing openness in culture, even among the kind of more, I hate to use this pejoratively, but among a more elite the elite tastemakers in culture of going, I think there is something beyond us, an openness to transcendence. I think we know even anecdotally of the ways in which we've seen a kind of psychedelic resurgence in the last 10 years. And there's no, there's people should be under no delusion that these storytellers are dabbling in that, taking an ayahuasca trip to go visit a shaman. And, so there is an opening to the doors of the transcendent. I think one of the things, though, that we are still struggling with, and I see it in Sinners as well. I had a very difficult time with Sinners. I had a very different experience of it because what it was describing was so true to a more pre-modern worldview. That what they were capturing in the role of the musician, playing the role of the shaman, is so it was so spot on to non-Western and pre-modern views of the world and the role of the musician, the role of the shaman in being a kind of mediator between worlds. And in many ways, even the presentation in the Juke of the way people were responding and moving into this frenzied state parallels in many ways, and like in ways that I found difficult to finish because I know the literature in the ancient Near East on pagan festivals, and so the primary purpose, let's take in an occult of Baal and the Baal cycle, or even in ancient Egypt, you have festivals in which the intersection of mind-altering substances, usually alcohol, but there's some signs of other hallucinogenics, trance-inducing music, and the trance-inducing music and the alcohol intending to lead to an altered state of consciousness, which climaxes oftentimes in I'll try to keep it as PG as I can, an X-rated state of frenzied activity. And so that whole purpose in the ancient world was so that when you get into that frenzied state, altered state of consciousness, that the god or gods you are worshiping would indwell you. And so when I see this in Sinners, I'm like, boy, I wonder if you know what you're really pointing at here. If it's just for you a kind of symbolic layer of narrative storytelling about the way in which the inspired musician is co-opted by, capitalist forces. Do you really know that what you're portraying here for most of history, and you get outside of non-Western cultures today, is real picture of spirituality? So all of that to say, you take Sinners or maybe some of the other things you had mentioned, the way in which kind of the individual pursuit of the transcendent is celebrated is in keeping with our cultural, especially among the cultural tastemakers, in keeping with an increasingly in vogue spirituality. So we're moving away from that kind of flat materialism to a spirituality that's open to experiences of the transcendent. But the thing that I would have concerns about is, and I've talked with even a number of people doing research in like the religious and spiritual applications of psychedelics, for example. One of my concerns is that we have lost sight of what many other pre-Western, including our own pre-Western Christian tradition and other non-Western cultures would also point to, is that what you encounter when you move outside of your egotistical concerns, when the blinders are lifted, not everything that you experience there is good. Sinners does capture that. But my concern is still for those kind of in those particular circles of wanting to have cultural influence, that in those circles there is a sense in which, oh, no, once we get beyond our selfish concerns and into the transcendent, into a spiritual experience, it's inherently good. And I would say, not only in the Christian tradition, but across many ancient religious traditions among the world's religions, whether it's Judaism, Islam as well, you have an awareness that not everything you encounter there is for your good. There are malevolent spirits as well. And so we do get that in Sinners, but I don't know if they were the way in which faith is portrayed as Christianity in particular is portrayed in some ways as kind of being, and I understand the cultural critique here, that it's associations with the oppressive power structure of fill in the blank. That's going to be a barrier, I think, to a lot of people who are still kind of stuck in this DIY spirituality. And my concern, when I come out of this is, sweet, let's get rid of the materialist view of the world because I don't think it's an accurate picture. I think it's a novel picture of reality. But I hope you know that when you tear those guardrails down, what you do experience there isn't always out to lead you to your good. And so now we have to determine, what is the highest vision of the good? What's our hermeneutic key for filtering through this new reality? It's not new. It's kind of new to us here in the West. We've lost sight of it. So yeah, there's some promise there, but there's also some pitfalls.
Yeah, no, so I'm going to summarize a little bit of what you said there, and I want to throw it to Jillian because I think it's some really interesting stuff that's dovetailed with some of the conversations we've had, both on the podcast and that Jillian and I have written about. One is, the reason that there's this transition at the Oscars from talking about sort of religion versus secular is because we've had this prevailing secularism for a long time, and it hasn't worked the way entirely that's as sufficiently as people thought it was. And so the trend is now culturally, again, apparently, according to Ryan Burge, one of the premier sociologists today, there are more people today who believe in the afterlife than did in the 1970s. So like there's a rise in, and then there's a rise in the spiritual, not religious, along with secularism. The kind of rise of secularism hasn't made people more atheist. There is a sense that I think you would say, agree with this, among the cultural elites, particularly. It's like, okay, this materialism has been insufficient, so we want to open the door back to some kind of spirituality. But that hasn't meant that they wanted to open the door back to, let's say, Christianity, or particularly with the rise of sort of anti-institutionalism, they haven't wanted to go back to institutional religion of whatever that is. The problem is they're still, because they're so distant from what any sort of pre-modern spirituality is, sometimes they have extremely naive, we'd say, like,
Yes.
people like, very, what you call it, touristy, white touristy views of these kinds of things. The one thing that's I've pointed out is that there's a lot of movies that kind of do this thing of like, oh, you know what, for particularly kind of women, it's like, what do we need in order to, have bring kind of female empowerment? What we really need is pre-Christian witchcraft, and it's like, great. That has a really great track record of actually overthrowing the patriarchy, which it never did in all thousands of years up until actually Christianity did that. So there is this kind of romanticization of these kind of spiritual practices that is naive of how that actually works to navigate that. It's kind of like, okay, you want to buy, you want a ticket, you have to pay the ride, and you're kind of not. Which is again like all of these old, old movies about like people. It's like, oh, let's go excavate the mummy, and then the curse comes with it. That would kind of be, the concern you're describing. It's like, okay, you want these pagan practices, you might get the anti-feminism along with it as well. You might get, that we are the kind that we're not so used to even in our kind of modern era. So Jillian, any kind of thoughts on that, or additional kind of ways that you want to dive into something like Sinners or some of the other views that Paul and I haven't dealt with yet, it's specifically?
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating, and I certainly agree, and I think, and this is mostly anecdotal, but I think kind of the way that I look at it is that 100% for, I don't know exactly, but say like past 10 years, past further than that, probably 20. Um, it was materialist, it was horizontal, it was let's tell exclusively secular stories from exclusively secular viewpoints, because we are secular and secular people are going to see these movies. And I think there's always a really interesting dynamic from within Hollywood of who's making the movies and who do they think they're making the movies for.
Really good.
Um, and and so I think for a while it was like well, we're secular, we're making movies for secular people. In the past 5 years, noticeably, and maybe even slightly further than that, it's become more, I think the rise of, and Joseph and I talk about this all the time, so this is kind of just a rehash, but the rise of streaming, the rise of independent cinema, the rise of like giving different people the ability to tell different stories has kind of led to people saying, and to me it feels like at least from the filmmaker's perspective, they're like, well, I was raised in this religion. It treated me poorly in these ways. I want to unpack it in this way, which is going to, of course, include a critique of organized religion. And that can be a super personal story. It can also be a pretty far removed story from what they've actually experienced, whatever. And then there are people like young people, there are older people who maybe, and then you're still kind of telling it to a secular audience, but you're telling people who have a similar history with religion or whatever. And so they're not necessarily, I think there's kind of, I think the opening of the door is kind of an expansion to not just like, oh, we're secular, we're telling stories for secular people, but oh, we actually have all dealt with religion, not all, but more people have dealt with religion than we've been thinking about, and there are people that have really interesting stories to tell about religion. But again, it does feel like baby steps because not everything is being as carefully thought out as it could. Um, you know, there are some critiques like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like exclusively older movies, but some critiques of religion are treated the same as others that are really wildly different, and they shouldn't be kind of treated with the same sort of like severity. You know what I mean? Um, and so anyway, so it does feel like baby steps, and this, I guess, yeah, it feels like a turning point year, maybe. So I guess I'm curious whether in the future we'll start to see better, different, unique stories on religion. So yeah, I mean, I guess the only other like movie that I have, which kind of contributes to this, is like the way that Train Dreams isn't about organized religion, but it's a sort of not new agey, but a lot of new agey type people have that same connection to nature and wanting to reconnect with the world and, all of that kind of thing. Which I think is kind of just a similar, yeah, like spirituality, a connection to the world, this kind of in vague terms, a connection to people around me through the earth and meditativeness and mindfulness and all that kind of stuff, like very in vogue. And not to say that all of that again is a bad thing. I think that there's a lot of that is good and worth pursuing. And there are several movies that have come out over the past 5 years that have been baby steps, but that I've really liked and that have really moved me. So I guess, yeah, I'm curious to see where it goes. But yeah, it's very
Yeah, I
Yeah,
want
fun.
to highlight
I don't,
that, and then I want to highlight that and then send it to you, Paul,
mhm.
which is
Yeah.
that we're talking about general trends as there's been a general trend towards spirituality, but you shouldn't overlook what Jillian just said, which is part of the movement is that more diverse groups of people are telling the
Mhm.
stories. And of course, when you get that, you get a more diversity of portrayal of religion and faith in Hollywood. Again, it's not a coincidence that one of the most thoughtful, unpacked, nuanced portrayals of faith at the Oscars is in Sinners, which is made by a black man about a very particular black experience while also being universal in many ways. And so that is a really good thing. That's one thing that people didn't talk about when they talked about diversifying filmmaking and independent filmmaking being important. A lot of times people didn't talk about the faith aspect, but that has been an effect of it. So now to you, Paul.
Yeah, well, even just as a side note, the statistically, if you look at if you break down traditional religious groups in America into their smaller, smaller demographics, where you say Catholic, mainline Protestant, historic Black, African American church, evangelicals, the two groups that actually have the best retention rates. When you ask, when you were a teenager, the religious identification that you identified with, I said that twice, as a teenager, did that carry on into adulthood? And the two groups that actually fare the best, though you would be surprised by the cultural narrative around this, is the African American church and and evangelicals. So it's not a surprise to me that someone raised in the historic Black church and has that experience would have a sense, especially when it comes to music, of the potency, the spiritual potency, the music, which still seems to be missing. And there certainly is a part to play within evangelical church culture of having a better relationship to culture that isn't inherently hostile within your own narrative structure. But there seems to be still an absence of those kinds of stories being told in culture, despite the fact that statistically you are more likely to be raised a nun, None, and become an evangelical than you are to be raised an evangelical and become a nun. So there's just an interesting, for me, a kind of a split between where the cultural tastemakers are getting their notions of religion and where maybe you might say like mainstream America has a particular experience of religion. I did want to talk about, something that you said about, kind of this sense that there might be over the last 5 or 10 years, something more spiritual happening here. And it reminded me of Ian McGilchrist's, work in The Master and His Emissary. And I think one component of this deserve some attention is McGilchrist's argument is that we have been largely dominated by a kind of left brain, rational view of everything, forcing everything to fit within the rational, the rational, mechanical, rational view of the world. And if you look back historically, post-Enlightenment as this kind of movement towards the emphasis of the rational and the mechanical view of the world, you always do get with that a counter-reaction of romanticism. So when you describe what is that kind of general sense, whether it feels somewhat new agey or environmentalist, when you step into the story of Train Dreams and it so beautifully captures the created world and the created order, and it appeals to something spiritually in us. Within McGilchrist's frame, you might say, well, that might be a recovery of the noetic right hemispheric way of engaging with the world. And so when we have these, not to sound like a total Hegelian here, but when we have a particular thesis, which is rational, mechanical view of the world, it's all able to be mastered and ordered by left hemispheric thinking, and we're gonna turn this into essentially like all of reality into like a German automobile plant. It's all predictable, mechanized. You are going to get necessarily a counter reaction that tends towards the more romantic. It tends to the poetic and the noetic. And so I think that's an interesting thing to track, is these things do move. I think Hegel is right. There is a thesis, and then culturally we get the antithesis. That's a kind of conversational, dialectical conversation partner with the past values and norms. And you get these things in dialogue. So it will be interesting to me, because I think you're spot on, Jillian, in saying that we have seen increased openness in these stories to a vague spirituality. I mean, among the spiritual but not religious, over 70% of them say that they have experienced some sense of the spiritual in trees and in nature. So among that group, which is not an insignificantly small group of people, there is that openness. And so a beautiful story like that, I mean, I think a lot of the appeal of the great cinematography that we see, even in a Dune film, you could have a CGI filled, Star Wars prequels kind of version of telling the last two Dune portrayal of the last two Dune stories, but instead you get this inhabited world. It's aesthetically compelling. It appeals to that more noetic side. So it's interesting to see that. I think Sinners was remarkable, especially in the first 45 minutes of capturing that beauty. Train Dreams did a really good job as well. I think another thing that might be interesting to kind of sort out here is also the trend that we have seen, especially since like a post Top Gun Maverick, kind of in what I've been calling and many others have called a kind of cultural vibe shift, to maybe not jump right away into stories that are recovering traditional religious doctrine or affirmations of particular points of historic Christian metaphysics, but are recovering something that might be a more traditional value system. So I think about F1 as a great example of this. Going into F1, based on the previews, I had wondered whether or not this was going to kind of become like a racial struggle theme. And we're going to kind of be going through what I feel like we've gone through ad nauseum for probably 15, 20 years of here's the white guy, and Brad Pitt, and he's at fault. And here we have the young black voice who's always in the right. And we didn't get that. Instead, we got something much more nuanced, which was a picture of what real competition in team settings looks like. Are people with real human motivations that aren't just reducible to those kind of racial archetypes, trying to figure out how to collaborate and work together. You also saw, which was something reminded me of both Top Gun Maverick and Twisters, the sequel, which I was unexpectedly enjoyed. You saw in F1 this relationship between Brad Pitt's character and Kate McConaughey, is that her name's character in the film, which wasn't just, again, a reduction to the male is wrong and the female you have to be a girl boss in order to have power. And instead, what you had were people that kind of had maybe more traditional masculine, feminine dispositions that were learning how to not see each other in a zero-sum struggle and zero-sum game of competition. And I loved, spoiler here, I loved the final line she gave in that last race where these two men, very prideful, arrogant, are learning how to come together. Brad Pitt's character and her character have had to learn how to bring their shared strengths together. And in order to win, she yells out to them, in order to win, someone has to sacrifice. And that was the hermeneutic key to understand what is going to make all of this work together is sacrifice. It's other-centered love. That might not be explicitly giving, they didn't go to a church service afterwards. They didn't huddle for a pre-race prayer, but that is an inherently Christian message at its core, that in order for all of us to succeed, we cannot view this in a zero-sum game between races, between genders, between classes. Someone has to sacrifice. And so we have to move towards each other. So it's been interesting to see those kinds of themes in a film like F1 that might not be, again, making explicit religious connections, but there's an implied religious substructure to that narrative.
Yeah, no, I love all of that, except, I really just can't stand it when somebody says that they agree with Hegel. I really can't, that's my one line. There's a couple things that I want to kind of highlight, and then we'll send it over to Jillian and then back to you to kind of finish us off. One of those is, explicitly, as you're talking about this, one of the things that I'm thinking about is, of course, this idea that, okay, so we're recovering something. We're not quite sure what we're recovering, though. And one of the things I think is still really very important, even about something about F1, is they do this whole thing about, competition and then collaboration. But at the end, Sonny, Brad Pitt's character, still leaves. He doesn't want to reintegrate and actually become a part of that community and stay. He still wants to, as an individual, go off and pursue that freedom. And that's something, again, I still see with so much of this spirituality is people want to reintegrate spirituality, but they don't want to give up actually any sort of individuality to be part of a community that's there.
Yeah.
And what I see, of course, is what's surprising. I've talked to Ryan Burge about this. That is the most harmful form of spirituality, is the spirituality you do on your own as an individual. Almost all the data that we have for moral formation and benefits, individual benefits people get, almost all of it comes from doing it in community. Again, there's actually data that if you're a man particularly, if you are individually spiritual and not part of an actual community, you become worse as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the things I think is sort of dangerous here, is that they're actually endorsing a kind of spirituality which is worse than the kind of religion that they are skeptical towards. On the flip side of that is, far be it from me, obviously Ian McGillicrest is much smarter than I am. But one of the things that I think in the conversations I have with people who are really big fans of him is the fact that I think it's wrong to say that and you alluded to this, that have lived in a predominantly left brain culture. I think because you have that, but yeah, but what makes the most money? It's movies and video games. It's fantasy. You have these parallel things going on. I think what's actually being done, which I'm very optimistic about, is people are starting to talk about ways we can reintegrate them. So how can we do both our view of reality that be both left brain and right brain? And you're seeing a lot of this with people like, Jonathan Haidt, who I love, but he's saying like, look, actually we know that the only way for human beings to have a horizontal relationship with each other is if they have collectively a vertical relationship with God. And of course he goes on, and this I always roast him on my podcast for this because I love him, but also because this is one of the silliest things I've ever heard. He says that, all my religious friends say that we have a God-shaped hole in our hearts, and I agree with them. I just don't believe that there's a God that fills it. And I think that our culture, the left brain people in our culture are starting to come to the fact that actually human beings, whether or not you think that's individually or just collectively, and that's a whole Ryan Burge controversy again, is that we need both the left brain, right brain hemispheres to be integrated. So how do we do that? And I think what's interesting, and I'm looking at Hollywood in these movies and going forward, is I'm seeing them as figuring out how we integrate them. And now I just want to put one more thing, because you mentioned the fact that we don't see it integrated in Hollywood as evangelicals. And I think one of the, and demographically, I mean that, not theologically,
Yeah.
demographically,
Right.
as you mentioned, that group of Christians, that's the group, again, we're not seeing as much. And one of the reasons I think is, and I'm not saying this in a negative way, but evangelicals are building their own film industry. They're not going into Hollywood to make movies in Hollywood. They're making it within the faith-based film industry, or the based faith film industry, as that whole thing going on. And now I think that there is a potential reintegration that's happening through things like, The Chosen and 5 and 2 Studios and the Wonder Projects. They're in alliance with Amazon. We're actually I have friends at the PGA who they are having to vote on the House of David, on certain things. And so that alliance with Amazon that some of these are having may help to start to reintegrate it into representation in Hollywood. But I think that's a sociological factor in the fact that we don't have as much representation. And again, I'm not blaming evangelicals entirely for this. Some of this is because Hollywood has not been welcoming to people of that demographic as well. There's enough to go around, but that's a factor that I think that's worth considering. So we definitely want to respect Paul's time and everybody's time. My time, you don't have to respect my time. That's fine. But Jillian, what would be kind of your last cap that you want to say that we haven't said yet? And then we'll throw it to Paul.
Yeah. Joseph, that you just made a bunch of really great points that kind of answer the question. Yeah, you do great. That kind of answer, like, are these Best Picture nominees, like, are those the be all end all? And I think you have kind of given the answer that I wanted you to give. So thank you for playing right into my hands and all that. But in saying that, I think you're totally right that the evangelical film community is building their own, like, their own industry, for better or for worse. There's a lot of pros and cons of that. And I think something that is interesting and something that I have been, that I've kind of mentioned throughout is I think the Oscars still have relevance. I mean, they have relevance to me. They have relevance to all of us. We're here talking about them for an hour. There are people that are going to listen to it, which is awesome. And I think, we're confirming their relevance, but I do think that maybe there's a decline in their relevance, certainly from their first 50 years, probably. Because of what I mentioned earlier, like the rise of independent cinema, the rise of streaming
And
services,
erotic culture, yeah.
yeah, the way that people love horror now, and the Oscars don't really I mean, okay, Sinners, obviously one exception to the rule. So I've just proved myself wrong there, but the way that it doesn't recognize all horror, when a lot of horror now strives to be highbrow, strives to be very aesthetically pleasing and cinematic in all sorts of ways. So I just think it's interesting. And Joseph is really good about talking about box office numbers as well and kind of the impact that is had there. But sometimes like all a movie needs to have cultural relevance is like people talk about it on Twitter for a couple weeks, and
Mhm.
that's just so different than it used to be. And so it's really fascinating to me to see what these films are doing, but to also see what's outside of that. And I'm glad that we've kind of talked outside of the bounds of the Oscars, despite this being the Oscars podcast, because I think not that, you know, these aren't worth considering because they are and they're great films, but because I think it's really interesting the dichotomy between what the Academy selects and what audiences select, or and where there's overlap, where there's differences. So I'm really interested to see the future, both in evangelical faith-based film spaces, and to see what wins the Oscars, if it's Sinners sweep across the board, if there are surprises, if Sinners wins one award or two. Yeah, I'm really interested to see what's coming. Not necessarily because that means that those are the most deserving films or the best films of the year, but because it kind of reflects what a certain group of people thinks about the state of film this year, which I think is really interesting.
Very cool. And Paul, what would you finish us off with?
Yeah, I'm just I think you're right, Jillian, in thinking about what the mechanisms of cultural influence and the technologies that have changed that. And there's no coincidence that as these technologies which give individuals more access and more of voice, that we get this kind of rising populism across culture, not just politically, but a sense that a kind of anti-institutionalist, anti-elite sentiment is, and I would expect, I won't invoke the E word right now, but I would say that we are probably going to see more of that, more distrust of institutions, and more distrust of, the elites. For I hate using that term, and so it makes me wonder a little bit about
The elites
what.
in the room right now.
Yeah, right. I think it'd be interesting to see where one weird place that I often look to see if something has cultural influence is how much it gets memed. I think the frequency and use of
100%.
memes is a
Yeah.
sign of, at the popular level, relevance and influence. And it's kind of like meta modern mode. You can use it ironically to still communicate a sincere connection. And so, what will it look like for which one of these stories and films will have a lasting cultural influence remains to be seen in the memes over the next 5 years, because it's not just the immediate viewing and it's not the critic's choice that gives us an indication of how much cultural influence and impact. So we have this kind of top down, but we also have a bottom up selection. So you have the top down, which is like, hey, we are the people that study this. We give our life to this. These are the ones that we are selecting as being of worth value. And that certainly influences most people that don't have those kinds of proclivities. But over time, this stuff that really lasts seems to be, yeah, there are Oscar worthy ones, but you think about, well, did The Matrix ever win an Oscar? I mean, maybe for special effects or something like that. It's hard to picture in my lifetime like a cultural text across multiple domains and spheres of culture that has more cultural influence in my lifetime than the first Matrix movie or Star Wars. So the things that become guiding stories, these last few years, I often look for where's the memes? Where are the memes at? And that might be a sign of kind of deeper level of penetration of these of influence of these stories.
Well, I'm convinced Religion Unplugged, we need to start memeing ourselves. That's what
Do
I'm
it. That's right.
So, well, thank you so much, Paul. This has been so cool. I hope you guys have been given more tools to be able to think about the stories that were being told, whether in the faith realm or in this Hollywood realm, and where those overlap and where those diverge. So, Paul, where can people, if people really want to see what you're doing, where can they go to find your stuff?
I mean, from a social media side, X is where I'm most active. You can also subscribe to my newsletter or reading the Zeitgeist. And yeah, if you follow me on X, you'll find links to all the other relevant things. Or go to my website, paulanleitner.org. It's got all the other stuff. You can pre-order my book too. I'll make a shameless plug for that because I worked really hard on it, and that would be good places to connect with me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Paul, so much for being here today. Thank you,
Thanks for
Jill.
inviting me.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening and watching. And remember, this is Religion Unplugged, your one-stop shop for all the best religious news and culture.